Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Informed Voices Media Literacy webinar series. We are happy to see so many of you joining us today for our last session titled The Psychology of Manipulation, Why We Fall for It. Before we begin, just a few quick notes. This is a 6 webinar series, and to receive a certificate from us, participants need to attend at least 4 sessions and complete the short quiz at the end of each webinar. So today's quiz will be shared towards the end of the session. So please stay with us until the end. And on a more personal note, today's session is especially meaningful for us, for former Fulbright alumni, uh, because we had the opportunity to meet with today's speaker during our Fulbright journey at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And we are happy to reconnect in this professional space. And I'll now hand it over to Mr. Dan Alexandru Kita, my wonderful co-host, and he will introduce himself and our speaker. Dan, the floor is yours.
Good evening to everybody. Thank you, Shalala. Hello, everyone. My name is Dan Alexandru Kitsa. I'm a PhD in political science and a media literacy Fulbright scholar, and I'm joining you today from Romania. I'm very glad to be co-hosting this session with Shalala. It's a real pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Sedona Chinn. Dr. Chinn is an assistant professor of life sciences communication at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She holds a PhD in communication and media from the University of Michigan and researches how people make sense of uncertain and competing claims about science, health, and the environment. Her work focuses on credibility, expertise, social media influence, and the psychology behind what people often call doing your own research. We're very excited to have her with us today. Dr. Chinn, thank you for joining us. And of course, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited and happy to be here and to reconnect with those of you who I have met before. For those of you who have met me before, I gave a kind of similar talk, so you might see some of the similar things. So if there's anything in particular you would like me to go into more detail on or ask more questions about, I would be very happy to do so, and I'm very happy for the Q&A for us to discuss things that are very relevant. A lot of my research is coming from a US perspective, and so you'll see that in some of the research and ideas I'm presenting, and I would really, for myself and my own research, really appreciate your insights and feedback and what resonates with you and what might not, and that can propel research further forward. So I'm very excited to be with you all today. Brief introduction to myself. I guess I'm at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I recently got tenure, so I'm very excited about that. And yeah, so my research, generally speaking, is how do people navigate the conflicting, competing, and overwhelming information that they get. And some people dive into it and want to do their own research. Some people opt out of it and want to ignore all information and just live their own lives and avoid all information that they can. A lot of my research concerns science, not all of it, but most of it concerns scientific topics, and that adds another layer of uncertainty and complexity because all scientific information is to some degree tentative and uncertain and unknown. So in my research, I've done work around politicization of scientific topics in US news media and looking at how levels of agreement and disagreement are represented and how conflict is represented in that space and what effects that has on people's attitudes about scientific topics. I think it's unsurprising that when people see scientists disagreeing in the news, whether it's real or not, they're a little bit skeptical of that topic that's being discussed. They might wait and see to see how they work the research out. I also do a lot of research around the dynamics around expertise and who sees experts as somebody who's like them in their social group and who might see scientists or experts as somebody who's outside their social group that's competing with their social group or in conflict with their social group in different ways. A lot of my research recently has to do with the themes around doing your own research, which is a popular buzz phrase in the US now, that people claim they don't want to listen to just passively listen to what's being told to them. They want to be active and engaged in doing their own research. And there are certainly benefits to that, that we want people to be informed and engaged citizens. We want people to be engaged in their healthcare and in their treatment plans. And there are also groups that have very, very good reason to be skeptical of the information that's coming from official sources in the US. And doing your own research is a way of protecting yourself and finding information that's most useful to you. However, on the other hand, this is also kind of an anti-establishment orientation and position that a lot of times the people who talk about doing their own research are not actually doing any more research, but they're relying just on their gut feelings and rejecting the expertise of journalists and news media and these things. In that vein, also, I do a lot of work on social media influencers and why people listen to influencers on social media for health advice or political information or these sorts of things, that influencers occupy this space of being kind of an expert, but also like you. So it's achievable. And so they have that dual kinds of persuasion happening. And I'm happy to talk about any of that more. But today, my focus on this talk is sort of a broad discussion of what is misinformation, why do people believe it, and then at the end, a little bit of thinking about how do we tailor our conversations based on trying to understand why people believe it. So some of this in the lecture series you may have gotten already. And if that's the case, you can feel free to tell me to move along. Or if it's useful refresher, that's good too. But I'll get into that and talking a bit more directly about what is misinformation, and then I'll spend most of my time on point number 2, why do people believe it? That will lead into point number 3 of the default assumption that most people have when thinking about misinformation is that they want to then share accurate information. And after talking about why people believe misinformation, we'll talk about why that's not always the most effective strategy. And then we'll take just a few sort of key points of what can be more effective than that moving forward. So I'm going to start with imperfect definitions of misinformation because it's increasingly, or maybe has always been, very difficult to define. Some basic definitions that we often hear that are just useful for my talk and the words I use and what I mean when I use these words. For misinformation, I am referring to verifiably false information that was not intending to mislead anyone. Somebody genuinely believed this when they were sharing it, even though it is wrong. And people might do this out of just not checking their sources before they share it. They might be concerned and they want to protect other people. And so they're doing this out of the goodness of their heart, sharing this false information. And that's different from disinformation, which is that more deliberate sharing of false information that you know it is false when you are sharing it and you're doing it to mislead someone. The purpose there is to gain some sort of power or advantage in some way, or to sow confusion and mistrust. It's deliberate here, there's intentionality. Now, most of the time when we're talking about these topics, we don't know. We don't know what people's intentions are when they're sharing false information. And so misinformation becomes sort of an umbrella term to cover all different types of misinformation, and I'll talk about a few more types here in a minute. But I will also point out that my definitions are problematic because verifiably false is a challenging thing. When you think about health claims that are circulated on the internet, a lot of times, one, for example, that is popular in the US is that celery juice will cure different diseases, cancers, etc., if you drink celery juice in the mornings. And verifiably false, we can't verify that that's not true. It's verifying a negative, also because there's been no research on it at all. Because why would anyone research that? Because there's no signs to point to that being an effective strategy. And so there's just no research. So then you can't verifiably falsify something. It's also the question of, is it easy to verify within the public domain? Does the public have knowledge that this is false? Or is the knowledge that proves something is false behind paywalls and in research journals and articles that the public does not have access to? Do you need to have an engineering PhD to understand why something is not true? Then that's not publicly accessible. So even these definitions are problematic, but they're shorthand for false information. In the context of news in particular, and we're thinking about media literacy and we're thinking about news, it's sometimes useful to think about misinformation and disinformation not as a concrete thing, but sort of existing along a spectrum. And this was a resource put together by an organization called First Draft News. They have a lot of resources for journalists and for people teaching media literacy, both in the US and globally. So that might be something to look at and see what they're doing. They were very active, especially during the pandemic, but it might be useful. I'm not exactly sure what they're doing right now. I should probably look that up. But they made this sort of spectrum of misinformation that started from low manipulation or low intention, from satire and parody. It's a joke that someone doesn't realize is a joke. I'm sure we've probably all had parents or grandparents not realize that this is a comedian telling a joke. It's not real, and you have to explain to them that this is a joke. And so they weren't intending to deceive anyone, but if somebody is less media literate, if somebody is less familiar with the context, then that can sometimes be taken out of context. There's examples of satirical news organizations that are just meant to entertain. They're fake. Everyone knows they're fake, but being taken up by international media reporting companies thinking that they're a legitimate source. They weren't intending to fool anyone, but people were misled anyway. And then we start to get into sort of maybe dubious journalistic practices where maybe you have a clickbait headline that doesn't match the content of the story. There's a little bit of intention there. Or you start to really be reframing, like all the information is accurate, but it's being presented in a way that's really pushing one angle. That's more manipulation. And then you start sort of towards the middle of the spectrum, this false context, getting into content that is genuine content that's shared out of context. So whether that's sharing a photo from a protest of a broken window, but that window was broken before the protest, but that implies that the protests were violent, these sorts of things. Or often what happens in on social media, in around protests, around uprisings, is that you will get videos from previous protests, years in the past, that are being presented as the contemporary or the current situation. And as we get further along towards more manipulation, you start to get into content that is directly designed to deceive by being a fake news outlet, or by using AI or other media editing tools to create content that is false. Again, this is a US problem, but oftentimes all of this or anything you don't like is referred to in the US as fake news. When researchers are talking about fake news, they're talking solely and exclusively about completely fabricated content, completely 100% generated content designed to deceive people. So that might be one misalignment between sort of the popular discourse around social media and misinformation and research on misinformation when we're saying, well, fake news isn't really that big of an issue. There's not a lot of fake news out there. It's much more difficult to try and address these middle areas. That is, there's something genuine here, but it's out of context, or it started accurate and it's being manipulated in some way. And the other definitions I want to give you before moving on to why people believe misinformation is just to make one distinction. And that is people who believe misinformation. That is people who have false beliefs, they have misperceptions, that they believe things that contradict, again, this is another problematic term, best available evidence in the public domain. What information is accessible to the public? How do we evaluate best available? These are things that might differ based on groups of people and where you are and what information you have access to. So these are misperceptions that people believe. And oftentimes people who believe something that is false think that they have a high level of knowledge and certainty about that topic. And that's different from somebody who doesn't know. Somebody who's ignorant, somebody who doesn't know a lot about this topic, doesn't care a lot about this topic, is usually pretty willing to admit, I don't know. You tell me. I don't care. And usually willing to take in any information that you give them because they know they don't care and they know they don't know very much. So people, when we're thinking about correcting misinformation and why do people believe misinformation, this is a useful distinction because people who don't know are usually very receptive to whatever you would like to tell them about this topic. People who think they know already may be more resistant to that because they think they're knowledgeable and they feel certain. So we'll return to this a little bit at the end, but I just want to make that distinction as well. All right. So before I keep going, do we want to pause for questions or do we want me to just keep talking?
You can ask questions if you want. I think they will be active.
Okay. Maybe we do like a 5-minute question break if there's
Yes,
anything
yes.
right now. Let's do that because then otherwise I'm just
Feel
talking
free.
for a long time.
Dear Mrs. Madam Sedona Chinn, your explanation is just very clear. It is very brilliant and perfect that I'm understanding you and figuring out and getting you very clear. Because sometimes the pronunciation, maybe the accent of some abroad countries, people are vague, but I'm understanding you 100%. When you were explaining the word misunderstanding and misunderstanding, and then I have screened it for myself because before I was in a hesitation and I didn't know the comparison of both two terminologies, but right now everything is clear. Thank you so much.
Good, thank you. I'm glad.
If you don't mind, I could read one question that we
Yeah.
have here in the chat. Miss Kenjebu Osmanova, what is the main difference between misinformation and disinformation, I guess? Yeah,
Yeah.
disinformation,
The
misinformation.
main The main difference is the intentionality. That is, did you mean to share this false information, or did you not know that it was false information when you shared it? So misinformation is not intentional. You didn't mean to share false information. And disinformation is more strategic, it's more planned, it's on purpose. But most of the time we don't know because unless somebody admits it, which they usually will deny that they knew it was false, so we use misinformation to cover most examples unless we can demonstrate that, oh, you knew this was false and you shared it anyway.
Can we call misinformation accidentally and disinformation kind
Mhm.
of purposefully or targetedly?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of thinking about it, yes. Right. I'll keep going and then I'll stop at the end of this section again and we'll do another set of questions. One area that before I move on, one example that I often struggle with to know whether it should be misinformation or not is when people share their own personal experiences around some health topic on social media. And it's something that is not scientifically proven or correct, but they say it worked for me. And they're encouraging other people to do it, but they're not saying that it's scientifically proven. They just say it worked for me, but it could encourage people to adopt dangerous behaviors. So I don't know how to classify that as misinformation or not because it's your personal experience, but it's being shared with some intention to spread that practice or behavior in some way. So it's a problem I don't know how to solve yet. All right. Why do people believe misinformation? So I will go through 4 different reasons why people people believe misinformation. Most of the time when we think about why people believe misinformation, we think that they don't know, that they, and I'm being general here, often somewhat rudely and somewhat meanly, people say, well, they're not very smart, or they, don't know, or they don't think right. They're not thinking straight. But there are reasons like that, and I'll talk about those first, but there are also other reasons, emotional, social, and structural reasons why people believe misinformation that are important to consider and that are often ignored. So, starting with the psychological reasons, starting with our brains and our thinking, it's important to remember that humans are not logical. We do not take in new information and update all of our previous beliefs to have more accurate information. More often, we take in information in ways that fits what we already know and believe. We fit it to our values, and if it doesn't fit with our values, then we will ignore it or we will dismiss it. So we don't just take in all this new information rationally, and we are biased in the information we take in. We are biased in the information we think is important. If it disagrees with us, we say that's not important, or that's just trying to, get under our skin. That's not important. It's not credible. We'll dismiss that information, or we'll weight that information as being less important in an evaluation. We also take we don't critically reflect on all of the information we get, because that would be exhausting and would make us very tired. We instead use mental shortcuts. We say, oh, that's coming from a doctor. Must be credible. How do I know it's coming from a doctor? Well, they're dressed like a doctor, so that must be credible information. This is coming from a news source I like. That must be credible information. That's coming from my aunt, who's kind of crazy, so that's probably not credible information. So we use source cues, we use message cues. We don't fact check every piece of information, and we can't, because that would be impossible. We would run out of time in the day. But the key concept I want to talk about here is the last one on the slide, is motivated reasoning. And that's a term that's used to describe the way we process and think about and take in information in a way that fits what we already believe about the world. The best place to see motivated reasoning is with sports fans. That you're watching a game and you're rooting for your team, and the other team does some sort of foul and you demand that they get a penalty. Your team does exactly the same thing 5 minutes later, and you go, why is that a penalty? That's I don't know what the ref's seeing. That's fine. There's no foul. You perceive things differently if you're rooting for your team. If your team does it, it's okay. If the other team does it, it's not okay. And you can see that in real time. But this happens in every part of our lives, whether that's information that doesn't agree with our political beliefs, our religious beliefs, our community values, or just what we already think we know about the world. If it goes against what we already know, it's actually just harder for our brains to process. It takes longer for our brains to understand. And so it's easier to take in information that confirms what we already believe. And this is how all human brains work around all different topics. It's not only political or not only conflict situations. This is just how our brains take in information. So the second reason, moving on from just humans are not logical, the second reason is that our emotions affect the way that we think. And our emotions and our thoughts are not separate from one another. They're always related to one another. So also different emotions affect our thinking in different ways. So for instance, a lot of research in misinformation has been done about anger and anxiety, because these are both negative emotions of sort of similar intensity, but they do different things to our thoughts and our behaviors. So when we're angry, we tend to not seek any other information, but just rely on what we know. We don't do any critical thinking. We take more mental shortcuts, and we take action. So that's a bad combination because we're not thinking and we're acting. I'm sure everyone has done something stupid when they are angry. And that's why, is because when you're angry, your brain shuts off and instead you just want to act. In contrast, when you're anxious and you're worried, you tend to seek out a lot of other information because you're trying to alleviate that worry. You're trying to calm that worry by getting more information. And in some ways, you're often less biased. You're often more willing to look at different positions and different behaviors and different thoughts than you would otherwise consider because you're trying to calm that worry. But it's very difficult to act when you're anxious. At work, it's very difficult to ask your boss for something when you're worried or anxious about it. Uh, so anxiety might lead to more information seeking, but less behavior, whereas anger might lead to less information seeking, but more active behavior. You see this in research on political campaigns. Political campaigns that make you angry get more people to vote. Political campaigns that make people worried, well, they'll seek information about the candidates, but not necessarily go vote. So you see these differences. So in the US, for instance, back during COVID, there were mandates around you had to wear masks in public spaces, you couldn't gather in large groups, and these restrictions, which were new restrictions, elicited something we call reactance, which is this oppositional response to feeling like your freedom is being taken away. It makes you angry and makes you want to act to restore that freedom. Teenagers are a really good example of this. If you're a teenager and you're going to clean your room and your parent tells you, go clean your room, then you will refuse to clean your room, even though you were going to do so anyway. But in this, we saw a lot of people who they didn't have to wear a mask before. There were not restrictions on where they could visit or gather before. And when there were those restrictions, there was lashing out and there were protests against this because that freedom that was there was then feeling like being taken away. So there was a lot of anger and there was a lot of mobilization of behavior of protests. And so a lot of misinformation on social media is spread through strong emotions because strong emotions elicit engagement on social media, liking, sharing, commenting, fighting in the comments. And that makes the information spread more widely and thus get more visibility. And so a lot of misinformation is being shared here with a lot of strong information. And so one thing that we think about sometimes recommending with media literacy interventions is not that you have to go fact check every piece of information you see. That would take too long. But maybe take a breath before engaging with this when you notice that you feel an emotional reaction and take a moment to say, oh, that's trying to make me angry. I wonder why. I also want to talk a little bit about, so there's been research mostly on the cognitive, the psychological, and the emotional reasons for believing misinformation. There's less work that pays attention to the social and structural reasons of why people believe misinformation. But these are also very important, that we look to the behavior of those around us from a very young age to determine what behavior is correct. You look to the people in the Zoom call and you see everyone has their microphones off, muted. I will turn my microphone to mute as well. We just look to the behaviors of those around us to see what is correct, particularly when these people are similar to us and they are in our communities and the situation is unclear, uncertain. When you're in a new place, you go into the classroom for a first time, you look around to see what the other students are doing. If all the students are talking and having a good time, you'll probably talk to the person next to you. If all the students are quiet, then you'll probably be quiet. And it matters more what the other students are doing than if the teacher tells you, please talk. And we always are telling our students, talk to each other, and then they sit there quietly and don't talk because they're looking to their peers, not to us, because their peers are more similar to them. So the expression, if everyone jumped off a bridge, would you jump off a bridge? And probably, yeah, you probably would, because everyone is doing it. It looks fun. It's the correct and appropriate thing to do. So these effects affect our behaviors and judgments, but it also affects whether we believe certain claims. If everyone in your neighborhood believes that it is not necessary to wear masks for COVID, it's not necessary to get vaccinated for COVID, and you are the one person who does, you're probably going to feel a social separation. They're probably going to say, oh, you're the weird one. Maybe they don't want their kids to babysit your kids. Maybe there's some social repercussions. You don't get access to resources and community. There was one example, again, during COVID, of an elderly man in a conservative area in the US, and he did not get vaccinated because that was the norm in his community. And then he got COVID and he was very sick and had to be hospitalized. And when he came out of the hospital and when he recovered, he told all of his friends, this is really serious. We should all get vaccinated because this actually, is really harmful and could be deadly. Rather than convincing all of his conservative friends to do so, his friends started distancing themselves from him because now he's different. He's the social different one. And so he lost friends through that experience. And finally, is thinking about societal structures and systems of power and what communities and groups have power and what communities and groups have been exploited in the past and been harmed. So, for instance, in the US, there's women and people of color are regularly dismissed by their doctors and healthcare providers, and their symptoms are not taken as seriously. In this case, it's reasonable, and also the practical protective thing to do is to be skeptical of the information you get from your doctor and go talk to your mother, your sisters, your friends, your community, and see what information they have based on their experiences. It's a proactive thing to do to help yourself, is to be a little skeptical of the information you get from your doctor, because either you or someone you know has had a bad experience where their doctor dismisses their symptoms and things. And so thinking too about who has access to information, who doesn't have access to information, who has a trusted relationship with the media, what groups have privilege in those spaces versus what groups are harmed by these systems of power, what groups have access to quality healthcare, what groups do not. That there might be reasons why, even if you're sharing correct information and good information, someone just does not trust you as the provider of that information. And so can you work with community leaders in these different groups to convey that message from somebody who they trust, rather than coming from you and who they might be skeptical of? All right. So that's my section, the big section for today, on why believe misinformation. There's lots of different reasons. We all believe things that are not true because we want them to fit with our worldview. Our brains and our feelings might drive us to believe misinformation that's scary, that makes us angry, that makes us worried. We might be more inclined to attend to that information. We might face social repercussions if we try to share accurate information or try to speak out against the misinformation. Or we might have very good reasons to mistrust the sources that are trying to share accurate information. So I'll take a break here for, again, another maybe 5-minute questions. If anyone wants to either unmute or Shalala, if you want to read from the chat, that's good too.
Okay, we had actually here one interesting question. Gabby, our another Fulbrighter, she asked about it. She asked about the difference between malinformation and disinformation.
That's a good question. I don't have a good definition off the top of my head. I think that a lot of these terms are used in different contexts, and it depends, I think, if they're being used in sort of journalistic context or education context or health context or political context, and they can have slightly different definitions depending on what problem someone is thinking about and what context they're in. So I don't have a good definition off the top of my head for malinformation versus disinformation. But I would imagine they are related in the sense that there is known false information going on there.
Yes, thank you. And do we have any other questions in the chat? Let me see. No, not yet. And I think just sometimes those terms can be used interchangeably, but malinformation, this is also kind of information that is shared to cause some damage, some harm, and often it can be related to private information.
Yeah, personal information. Yeah. More
Yes,
targeted.
if you have any questions, our dear audience, please feel free. You can type in the chat or you can ask it yourself.
Just no questions, but good comments that regarding to today's agenda, the psychology of manipulation, why we fall for it. Miss Sedona Chinn is preventing us from this way, not just to avoid such kind of misinformation, to avoid disinformation, not to get stuck into it, just to avoid and preventing us. And by her explanation, today I understood about the psychology, emotion, reactance, that it was kind of first of all not clear and then became clear for me, reactance, about the social influence affect our behavior, and society structures. Thank you so much for giving clear instructions, ma'am.
Thank you.
And maybe we can continue.
Okay.
We can go on.
Yeah. So I wanted to finish this talk with a little bit of discussion about how we then correct, or how do we think about intervening, and how do we think about correcting misinformation when we know that people might believe it for these different reasons. Because the first feeling that people have, especially my students, when they come into class and I teach about misinformation, they say, well, I know what to do. Just share correct information. That will fix the problem. And as we just talked about, and for all of the reasons that I laid out of why people believe false information, not having encountered the accurate information was not one of the reasons listed. The real difficulty is trying to correct misinformation when people have already seen the correct information and they chose not to believe it. So I want to talk a little bit about this assumption that we can just share accurate information. This is sometimes called the deficit model, that people don't have information. And if we just share more information, especially about science and technology and society, they will understand more and be more positive towards science and technology. So this assumes that the public doesn't know things, doesn't know about science, doesn't know about this issue. They don't have some information. And they have some negative feelings towards this issue, towards a scientific issue. And the reason why they have a negative feeling is because they don't know. And that this can be addressed by just giving them more information. You may be able to tell with how I'm talking about this that this is very different from what we have been talking about. And this is very much sort of, in many cases, has been refuted by research, that today people have more information than ever before, and they have access to more information than ever before. And most of the time, at least again, this is US context, trust in science and medicine is quite high. It's often just specific issues, whether that's stem cell research or climate change or COVID, that see controversy, but things like cancer research are not debated. You talk to your doctor will tell you about cancer research. It's often quite. The other thing we talked about at the beginning was that people who are ignorant, people who don't know something, often are very willing to admit they don't know and they're not certain, but they don't have any strong feelings towards it. It's people who think they know something, that have some knowledge, that have strong feelings. And people, again, on COVID, people who know the most about COVID often have the strongest attitudes, either for or against a policy. I think that's common across lots of different issues, that the more you know, the stronger your attitudes are, the stronger your positions are, the more you know. People who don't know a lot probably don't have a strong opinion. And the other thing is, just giving people more information doesn't address that we process information badly as humans. It doesn't address that we have that information might elicit some feelings that disrupts our thinking, or that there are social dynamics around this information, or that we might not trust where the information is coming from. So this is a common belief in the US among scientists who work with information, as well as among policymakers. Say, let's just share accurate information, give the public more information, and they'll fix their beliefs. But this really doesn't get at the reasons why people believe misinformation. Because misunderstanding facts is not the reason why people come to false information. It might be sometimes. That would be very convenient, because then we just need to readdress that understanding. But more of the time, there's emotions, there's social dynamics, and there's trust that's not there. And so you need to understand why people came to believe that misinformation before you can correct that misinformation. And often that's hard because people don't know why they believe things. Most of the time, if you ask someone, why do you believe what you believe? They'll justify it, but that's not the real reason of why they began to believe it. So we'll talk a little bit about how to figure that out. So one, I just want to say at the outset, it's very difficult to correct misinformation, and there's no easy answer for how to do it. And there's a few reasons why this is hard. One, even if someone corrects the misinformation and believes the correction, believes the accurate information, they still remember the misinformation. That can still elicit emotions. That can still think and affect your judgment. One student gave a good example of this in my class, that there was a piece of misinformation that aluminum in deodorant or antiperspirant could cause breast cancer. And so their friend had stopped using antiperspirant or deodorant with aluminum in it. And this person was very scientific, and so she got research articles to show there's no connection between aluminum and breast cancer. No connection. And the person said, okay, I believe you. I believe this research. I'm still going to buy the aluminum-free antiperspirant deodorant, just in case. It still affects your judgment, and it still affects your thinking, even when you know it's wrong. In addition, sometimes, especially in a scientific context, the misinformation is very clear, very straightforward. Vaccine causes autism. A, B, C. Very simple explanation of how the world works. And often science is more complicated, and it's more uncertain, and it's more confusing. And it's difficult for people to sit with uncertainty, to say, well, this chemical caused your cancer, versus to say, we don't know what caused your cancer. It's probably a combination of genetic things, environmental things, and just chance. That's very difficult. It's very uncomfortable. And so many people will prefer the simple explanation of misinformation to a uncertain, complicated, unsatisfying answer. And in addition, people's identities might be tied to that misinformation. If you're part of a social group, again, US, we saw a lot of polarization around COVID. If you're a conservative, you don't want to wear your mask because you're signaling to other conservatives that I'm part of your group, you're part of my group. We're against these people. And that can happen too with things that, that just a political party championing an issue. For instance, Democrats saying, we care about climate change, we're going to act on climate change. then in a two-party system, Republicans by definition say, well, then we're against that because there was that division there. And this can be very difficult to correct misinformation when you're not just saying, oh, what you think is wrong, your identity is wrong. That's very much a challenge to somebody, and they get very defensive and very confrontational about that. So we have Swiss cheese. Model Swiss cheese has lots of holes in it. And the idea is that every time you try and correct misinformation, every strategy to correct misinformation has some strengths, but has some weaknesses. And so you have to do lots of different interventions, lots of different strategies, and then maybe fewer people will get through those holes. Maybe there will be fewer gaps when you have multiple strategies all stacked up in front of each other. But there's no one that's going to solve all of the problems of the world. And I talked about this just recently, but it's also useful to I'll start here. When thinking about strategies to correct misinformation, thinking about the audience is very important, and being very specific about the audience, because different audiences might believe the misinformation for different reasons. Some people may be skeptical of a COVID vaccine because they're concerned about the side effects. Some people may be skeptical of the COVID vaccine because they don't trust the people who made it. Those are two different reasons, and those are two different audiences. And so it's useful to think about who are you targeting, and who do you want to have a conversation with. So I have general recommendations, mostly for conversations and maybe to get in classes to have conversations and think about what works and what you're comfortable with and what you're not, because many people are not even comfortable having a conversation with their friends, their family members about misinformation. And I completely understand that. It is not fun. And so these are some places to start, as well as some advice to give, but it's very slow, and it's not saying you have to go into a fight and win. So first of all, tailor your correction to your audience. For instance, I don't like getting shots because I'm afraid of needles. So if I say I don't want to get a shot and you start telling me that it's safe and effective, I don't care. I know that. I don't want a needle because it hurts. And so you're not tailoring that correction. I need to be told that it will be over quickly, you'll distract me, I won't see it, these sorts of things. If there's ways of affirming people's identities or values as you're giving the correction, for instance, for some religious conservatives in the US, when we talk about climate change, we might say, well, we want to steward God's creation of nature, rather than saying we want to support pro-environmental policies, right? Is there a way of tailoring the correction to fit with what somebody already knows and believes, so it's easier to mentally process, and so it doesn't make them defensive? It's important to not repeat the misinformation, because the more you say it, the more people remember it. So can you not repeat the false information, but instead repeat the accurate information more frequently? Use trusted expert sources. And by trusted expert sources, I mean their trusted expert sources. That might be their community leaders, religious leaders, friends, family members that they trust and believe, because we may have differences in who is considered trustworthy. And the other thing that I tell my students, especially when they're very scared to have conversations with their family over holidays, is to not try and persuade them, but instead to be curious and to ask them questions about, where did you first see that information? Did you believe it when you first saw it? Are you very sure of that information, or do you have some doubt? What made you believe it? What information made you believe that? What information didn't? And you can start with something like, I believe this and you believe that. and we're not going to change each other's minds, but we're family and we have a lot of other similarities. So I just am curious, how did we get to different positions? This kind of process sometimes is called motivational interviewing. When you ask someone, why do you believe what you believe? When did you start believing that? Why do you believe that? What is convincing? What is not convincing? To help them understand why they believe what they do, and to help them explain to themselves, is this something that I really strongly believe, or is this something that actually I don't believe that strongly? Oftentimes people are concerned about getting into fights with family members. And so approaching these conversations with curiosity is a good strategy of not trying to confront or convince anyone, as well as to know this is getting heated. I don't want to fight over the holidays. Let's take a break and we can come back to this conversation in a few weeks or the next time we have coffee. But we don't have to have this conversation now. We can take a break because I don't want to have a fight with you. And this is just another slide of similar information from the New York Times to prioritize your relationships, to ask questions like, where did you learn that? Where did this come from? When did you see it? Did you believe it right away? These sorts of things. Be willing to walk away and to remember that for someone who really strongly believes some misinformation, it takes time to change that because you have to admit that you are wrong, admit that you are duped. And that's very difficult for people to do, not only because you have to change your mind, but also because it's very shameful to admit that you were wrong. And that shame is something many people don't want to face. And so if you're asking them questions like, oh, when did you believe that? When did you get that? And planting seeds of doubt and seeds of uncertainty, then maybe they can get themselves out of that. And then it's an accomplishment that they saw the light and they did it for themselves rather than you just telling them they're wrong and bad and should be ashamed. All right, I think I'll stop there. I think that's the end of my slides. I don't think I have anything.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Chinn. And we now invite questions from the audience. Please feel free to type your questions in the chat or you can ask them. Can we consider misinformation as fake information? This is a question from the audience.
Yeah, so I think misinformation is often an umbrella term to sort of often used to describe all kinds of problematic information. And fake information that is made up, completely fake, is sort of a more extreme type of misinformation that is more intentional and designed to be harmful, usually.
Yes, and we have also prepared our questions. Dan, do you have any questions?
Well, to be honest with you, I don't have a question because Dr. Chin was so clear about what she tried to emphasize today, and I think everybody got the message. My only, if I were to have a question for you, Dr. Chin, this is the following. Are we actually talking about misinformation or disinformation or whatever? You know, there's a whole science behind it. Or is it just that people nowadays have strong opinions and they put a lot of emotional effort into, you know, their opinions?
Yeah.
And sometimes they don't chill out, they don't show enough liberal thinking because sometimes, you know, their attitude is what causes so much trouble. It's
Yeah.
not the fact that they're not willing to search for the um, to delve deep and understand what they are thinking about the world. Because if they were to be open about it, this would not happen. So I think we live in a polarized world, especially when it comes to not our opinions. They might be different or even opposite, but the emotions, the feelings we put into our opinions. And this is not okay, definitely. So the pieces of the advice you just showed a couple of slides ago about, talking to a family member and asking your relatives some questions. How did you get to that? How do you know that this is the case? This shows a level of understanding that a lot of people miss today, both in the US and the Western world, respectively. We have it everywhere, I guess. Most of the issues we face are related to politics, religious, let's say, values to a certain extent, or to threats. There's a lot of fear going on, and some people actually use this mindset, this anxiety that we currently experience as, adults, to create havoc, in politically, maybe from a political point of view, from a moral point of view, and create havoc in the sense of manipulating people's minds into thinking this way or that way. So I have no question besides the fact that I totally appreciate the way you've explained matters through.
Yeah.
So
I
thank you.
do, in my classes, I do end up spending a lot of time explaining to students that it really doesn't matter if somebody believes something false or not. It is those social interactions, and it's
Mhm.
can you have a productive conversation with over a difference of opinion, or can you not? And I think a lot of the reason why I focus on a lot of these tools and strategies for misinformation is because they also apply to uh, these challenging conversations around
Yeah.
not only,
To a certain extent, they overlap. You're right.
yeah.
Thank you again. Thank you once again, Dr. Chin, for sharing your expertise with us today, especially since you open up to a lot of people who live in Central Asian countries, in Eastern Europe. And we have our conundrums and worries to handle every single day when it comes to media and, social media in particular. And thank you to all participants for your thoughtful questions, those that were written down in the chat, and active engagement. We truly appreciate your time and interest in media literacy. And I'll now hand it back to Shalala for the final remarks. Thank you again, Mr. Dr. Chin, sorry.
Thank you, Dan. And once again, thank you, Dr. Chin, for such a valuable session. And dear participants, please don't forget to complete today's quiz to ensure your participation is recorded. And please stay tuned for our next fourth series, where we'll continue exploring media literacy from new and practical perspectives. And until then, stay safe, stay media literate, and make your informed voices heard. So, good evening. Just have a great evening and see you. See you next time. Goodbye.